The script for the following video is an excerpt from my 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley, a non-fiction which explores the history and folklore of the Nahanni National Park in Canada's Northwest Territories, a place popularly referred to as the Headless Valley. I'm very pleased to announce that an audiobook version of Legends of the Nahanni Valley is now available on Audible. If you'd like to get a copy of my book in audiobook, ebook, or paperback format, please check out the link in the description. This video contains references to several characters and locations with which the casual viewer may be unfamiliar. Any viewers interested in putting these elements into context can of course do so by reading my book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley, which you can find by clicking the link in the description. Of all the stories linked with this grim, austere land, that of Dead Man's Valley and the search for the lost Macleod mine is by far the most intriguing, and has mystified the North for 40 years. Philip H. Godsell, Romance of the Alaska Highway, 1944. The tale of the McLeod brothers and their lost gold mine is perhaps the most mysterious of the Nahanni's legends. Like all good frontier stories, it has a number of different and often conflicting versions. No two articles on it tell exactly the same story, and many credible contemporary frontiersmen espoused versions of it which were completely incompatible with one another. As disparate as many of them are, all versions of this great northern legend share a number of consistencies, the most important being their revolution around two main characters, brothers Willie and Frank McLeod. Willie and Frank McLeod grew up in and around Fort Liard, spending half their time at the fort immersed in the world of the Hudson's Bay Company, and the other half on the trail, in the company of frontiersmen, Metis, and Indians. By all accounts, they grew up to be extremely competent outdoorsmen, who could handle themselves in the wilderness as well as anyone in the Mackenzie region, reaching manhood, as one writer put it, with civilization as remote to them as their Indian friends. One day in the year 1900, a strange Indian sauntered into the trading room at Fort Liard. Unlike the trouser-wearing, Mackinaw-clad slavey Dene who typically visited the post, this dark-eyed, wild-looking brave wore a greasy, smoke-stained caribou skin robe in the old style. He was a Nahanni Indian, one of the mysterious nomadic people who hunted deep in the Mackenzie Mountains, living the old way, as their ancestors had for 1,000 years. Young Fred McLeod, the fort's new factor, was surprised at the lightness of the Indian's outfit. The Nahanni had no companions, nor did he carry any furs with which to trade. Aside from his primitive garb, his only possessions included an old hunting rifle, a pair of snowshoes, and a medicine bag, which he wore around his neck. Fred stared in disbelief as the Indian reached into the latter item and withdrew a handful of solid gold nuggets, which he promptly spent with the abandon of a man who seemed to have no true appreciation of their worth. At first, the Indian was reluctant to tell Fred where his treasure came from. After the curious trader plied him with tea and tobacco, however, the brave hinted that he had found his prize somewhere in the Nahanni Valley, south of the confluence of the Flat and South Nahanni rivers. With that, he collected his newly purchased goods and disappeared into the wilderness, never to return. Fred McLeod was torn. On one hand, he desperately wanted to ditch the trading room for the trail, head into the Nahanni with a pick and pan, and find the source of the Indian's gold. On the other hand, he knew that duty dictated that he remain at his post. His father had bequeathed him the position of chief factor at Fort Liard the previous year, and he was duty-bound to fulfill the family's HBC contract obligation. He was the family's primary breadwinner now, and could not afford the luxury of a prospecting venture. Reluctantly, he consigned himself to reality and forgot about the incident. Three years later, another Nahanni brave, this one a tall hunter named Little Nahanni, arrived at Fort Liard. Like his predecessor, he paid for his goods with raw gold, which he kept in a moose skin poke. With some prompting, Little Nahanni revealed that he had panned his gold on Bennett Creek, a waterway which empties into the Flat River about 5 miles or 9 kilometers upriver of the Cascade of the 13 Steps. Fred could remain idle no longer. He sent word to his elder brother Willie in Edmonton that a wealth of gold lay hidden somewhere in the Nahanni Valley. Willie immediately traveled north to Fort Nelson in northeastern British Columbia, where his brother Frank now worked as manager, and convinced him to accompany him on a prospecting expedition. Frank quit his post late that fall, and the two brothers headed up the Liard River and into the Nahanni Valley. The brothers met with some success that year, liberating an agreeable quantity of alluvial gold from the Nahanni's creek beds. When spring came, they returned to civilization and promptly squandered their hard-won earnings, losing much of it in poker games. They worked the best of their gold nuggets, however, a handful of gold chunks the size of beans, into a watch chain, which they gave to their brother Fred, who had since transferred from Fort Liard to Fort Providence on the Mackenzie Delta, just west of Great Slave Lake. The following January, Willie and Frank McLeod decided to return to the Nahanni, certain that a golden bonanza awaited them somewhere in its misty recesses. This time, they were accompanied by their younger brother Charlie. The three brothers began their journey in Edmonton, Alberta, where the majority of their family now resided. For some reason long lost to history, they reached their destination by an extremely circuitous route. First, they traveled by train to Vancouver, British Columbia, where they boarded a steamer that took them up the Pacific coast to Wrangell, Alaska. From there, they traveled by dog sled up the frozen Stickeen River to Telegraph Creek, two of the brothers breaking the trail on snowshoes, while the third handled the sled and dog team. The trio continued further northeast to the remote frontier settlement of Dease Lake, and made a grueling overland journey up the Cassiars and across the Liard Plateau. By the time they reached the Upper Flat River, it was spring. There, on the shores of the Upper Flat River, the McLeod brothers came upon a ragtag band of Slavey, Kaska, and Nahanni Indians. These natives were also panning for gold, and had evidently met with some success. They showed the McLeod brothers samples of their findings, gold nuggets worth $3 each on average, a considerable sum in those days. Although the Indians neglected to disclose the site at which they had found their sizable nuggets, the McLeod brothers suspected that they had done so somewhere in the immediate vicinity of their meeting place. They spent several weeks in the area searching for the source of the Indians' gold, panning the creeks there without success, before continuing down the flat to the mouth of Bennett Creek, known thereafter as Gold Creek. There, they found quality placer gold in paying quantities, which they laboriously separated from the sediment and stuffed into various containers. After a season of hard work, the McLeod brothers decided to head to Fort Liard, where they could restock their dwindling supplies before returning to the Nahanni the following spring. Using sluice boxes that the Indians had abandoned upriver, they constructed a crude scow, packed it with supplies and the placer gold they had acquired, and set out down the flat river. They successfully navigated a series of rapids before finally capsizing their craft on the treacherous Cascade of 13 Steps. Although the brothers survived the ordeal, most of their supplies, including nearly all of their gold, did not. Undaunted, the brothers continued on down the river. When they finally reached Fort Liard many days later, they were gaunt and emaciated, with nothing more to show for their trouble than an Eno's fruit salts bottle stuffed with 5 to 10 ounces of placer gold, which Willie had slipped beneath a sash tied around his waist in the hopes of protecting it. Nearly broke, yet determined to return to the site of their discovery, the McLeod brothers spent the rest of the year working for the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Simpson in the hopes of earning a grub stake. None of the northern traders would outfit them on credit on account of their gambling habits. The company pay was scant, and the brothers' accrual of prospecting supplies was painfully slow. While the McLeod brothers toiled for their grub stake, a young, mysterious Scottish steamboat engineer named Robert Weir slipped into Fort Providence with a boatload of supplies for the HVC post. Duty necessitated that he meet with Fred McLeod, chief factor at the time. During their meeting, Weir noticed the golden chain on Fred's pocket watch and asked him where he had acquired it. Fred told him that his brothers had made it for him from Nahanni gold, and that they were preparing to embark on another prospecting expedition into the rugged country in which they had found it. They needed supplies, Fred informed him, and were unable to secure an outfit on credit from the local HBC traders. The engineer thanked Frank for the information and promptly broke his HBC contract. Having come down with a bad case of gold fever, he traveled to Fort Simpson, met with Willie and Frank, and agreed to stake them on the condition that he be allowed to accompany them on their expedition. Willie and Frank took the mysterious engineer up on his offer, and the three men set out for the Nahanni that spring. For some reason, Charlie decided to stay behind this time. When the McLeod brothers failed to return to Fort Liard before winter, Fred McLeod at Fort Providence was not particularly concerned. Both Willie and Frank were seasoned outdoorsmen. Expert hunters and trappers, these two veterans of the subarctic could handle themselves in the wilderness as well as any Indian. Fred was sure that Willie and Frank would have little trouble living off the land if necessity required. Seasons came and went, and still there were no signs of Willie and Frank. Finally, in the spring of 1907, an abandoned canoe, similar to the type the Metis brothers and their partner brought into Nahanni country, was found bobbing in a driftwood pile somewhere on the South Nahanni. Word of the find quickly spread throughout the North Country via the moccasin telegraph, the frontier equivalent of the grapevine, and Fred McLeod was soon notified. Fred informed the rest of his family in Edmonton of the disturbing news. Charlie McLeod, determined to learn what had befallen his older brothers, traveled north the following year with his younger brother Danny. At Fort Liard, the brothers put together a search party consisting of Poole Field, Sergeant Joy of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and two of the Lafferty boys. Together, the 6 men headed up the South Nahanni in May 1908, prepared for the worst. After conquering the Splits, the notorious First Canyon, and the raging Cache Rapids, the party entered an open, bowl-like section of the valley. The men searched this area for some time, meticulously scanning the shoreline for any sign of human presence. Just as they were about to give up, one of them noticed a small clearing in the trees along the shore, its green foliage punctuated by the white flash of axe cuttings. The crew paddled over to investigate. No sooner had the party stepped onto the riverbank than Charlie spied a dog sled runner lying in the grass. On its side was an undated message penciled in one of his brother's scrawl. "We have found a fine prospect." When the party failed to find any additional clues in the area, they continued upriver. At the northern end of the saucer-like valley, just downriver from the entrance to the second canyon, they came upon another clearing, this one evidently the site of some long-abandoned camp. There, they made a grisly discovery. On either side of a long-dead campfire, beneath 2 rotting woolen blankets, lay a pair of human adult male skeletons. Both bodies, to the horror of their discoverers, were headless. One of them lay on its back, rolled neatly in its blanket, as if its former owner had died in his sleep. The other was sprawled out on its chest, its blanket twisted about it haphazardly, one of its bony arms reaching out towards a rusted rifle, which leaned against a nearby spruce tree. The manner in which the bodies were displayed suggested a nocturnal ambush. The first man to be attacked, the one lying on his back, was evidently killed in his sleep before he had a chance to defend himself, while the second had leapt from his bedroll in a vain attempt to reach his rifle before being struck down. Charlie quickly identified the bodies as his brothers from bits of tattered clothing, from Willie's gold ring, and from Frank's distinctive gold pocket watch, which dangled from a nearby tree branch. Shaken to the core, he and his companions proceeded to search the surrounding area for any evidence which might shed some light on the nature of his brothers' deaths. The company found neatly stacked crates filled with supplies, although the picks and shovels the brothers had brought into the country appeared to be missing. They also discovered a box containing extraordinarily rich samples of gold-bearing quartz, indicating that the McLeod brothers had struck it rich somewhere in the Nahanni Valley before their untimely deaths. A fine prospect indeed. Of the engineer Weir and of the McLeod brothers' missing heads, the company found neither hide nor hair. After burying their brothers' remains and marking the graves with a simple wooden cross, Charlie and Danny returned to Fort Liard, where they sent word to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police of their find, wholly convinced that Willie and Frank had been murdered. Suspecting foul play, the Mounties opened up an investigation into the McLeod brothers' deaths. The following year, a party of Royal Northwest Mounted Police officers from Fort Simpson accompanied Charlie McLeod up the South Nahanni to the scene of the crime, which had since acquired the ominous appellation Dead Men Valley. The Mounties investigated the site and concluded that Willie and Frank had likely discovered a golden bonanza somewhere in the Nahanni, whereupon their partner Weir, crazed with gold lust, had murdered them in their sleep and made off with not only the fruit of their labor, but also, quite possibly, their heads. The following year, a discovery was made which changed the Mounties' official opinion on the matter. In the woods about 3 miles south of Dead Men Valley, on some nameless tributary of the South Nahanni, a band of slavey Indians came upon an unidentified skeleton and reported their discovery to the RNWMP outpost at Fort Simpson. Corporal Arthur H. L. Meller of Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, the Mountie assigned to the McLeod case in 1909, assumed that the body was Weir's and, due to the fact that no gold was recovered along with it, made a controversial deduction. He concluded that Willie and Frank McLeod had lost their canoe, along with their supplies, through some freak accident and starved to death. While the brothers lay dying, Weir attempted to walk back to civilization, but perished from privation along the way. This theory was bolstered by a new revelation that the McLeod brothers had started out on their expedition ill-equipped and short of supplies, having headed into Nahanni country with only 50 pounds of flour and 5 pounds of tea, which they purchased in Fort Simpson. In light of the new evidence, the Mounties dismissed the deaths of the McLeod brothers as a result of an unfortunate accident, a position which they officially maintain to this day. Other residents of the Mackenzie region held views contrary to the official narrative, seriously doubting the claim that the McLeod brothers were victims of natural forces. By all accounts, Willie and Frank were superior woodsmen, who could handle themselves in the bush as well as, or better than, any of their contemporaries. Even if they did lose all of their supplies in a freak accident, many believed that they were quite capable of reaching civilization on foot, and would certainly not have succumbed to the elements at the same time, mere feet apart from each other. For many, it was obvious that Willie and Frank had been murdered. Central to the debate regarding the nature of the McLeod brothers' deaths is the question of how Willie and Frank lost their heads. A complicated query, considering the conflicting information regarding the state of the brothers' corpses at the time of their discovery. According to some reports, it was clear from the ragged condition of the corpses' severed necks that the heads had been ripped or perhaps twisted from their bodies, as if by brute force. Others claimed that there were signs indicating that the heads had been chewed off by some large carnivorous animal. Conversely, Charlie McLeod maintained that his brother's decapitations were almost surgically neat, as if done with a sharp implement, and believed that their murderer had dropped their heads into the South Nahanni River in order to conceal evidence of bullet wounds. And some claimed that the heads had evidently separated from their bodies through the natural process of decomposition. Some Mackenzie mountain trappers suspected that the brothers were slaughtered by a mad trapper or a fugitive from justice, perhaps an outlaw from the Yukon, who took their heads as trophies. Others grumbled that the mysterious Nahanni Indians, fiercely protective of their hunting grounds, likely had a hand in the McLeod brothers' untimely deaths, removing their heads in order to intimidate any whites who might come across their corpses. And some of the slavey Indians who visited Fort Liard, when asked their opinion on the matter, whispered that the gruesome deed was the work of the Nahanni, the giant, hairy, head-hunting wildmen, whom their people had long claimed haunted the Nahanni Valley. Following the discovery of Willie and Frank McLeod's headless skeletons, word spread that the Metis brothers had stumbled upon a fabulous golden bonanza sometime prior to their deaths, a rumor supported by the fact that samples of rich, gold-veined quartz were found along with their corpses. Before long, a handful of hardened, fearless prospectors decided to search for this lost gold, taking their chances in the mist-shrouded vale to which their resultant misfortunes would soon bequeath a ghastly epithet: Headless Valley. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support this channel, please check out my book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.